Now you can be excused to be back there and take care of your other duties again. Or taking care of my duties, I'll put it that way. Well, it's good to be here this evening. And we're going to take a look at the book of Hosea this evening. As much as we can in the time we have allotted. Let's see what we can get accomplished. As we mentioned last week, this is the first of what are considered the minor prophets. Brother Eric, I think that's you in the sound room. Could you key up that chart for me? Thank you so much. Because we're going back in time as far as chronology in the scriptures. Hosea is like the fourth one from the top. Down here at the exilic prophets, or however you say that. Daniel is where we were last week. If you notice the time difference, Hosea was approximately 760 to 710. Daniel 604 to 535, so well over 100 years earlier. Thank you, Brother Eric and Brother Scott. So we're back in an earlier time frame, but it is still the same basic thing in that we're seeing Israel being spanked, whatever term you want to use, punished for their lack of being faithful to God. And as Daniel, was to Judah, now let me straighten up. I'm sorry, it's going to be a rough night for me. What Hosea is to Israel 100 years later, because Daniel and Jeremiah were contemporaries. Jeremiah was to Judah in captivity. Hosea is to Israel in captivity because Israel went into captivity almost 100 years before Judah did. Quite a long period of time there. So that's what we're looking at this evening, starting with Hosea. One sentence explanation. Hosea is told to marry a prostitute who leaves him, and he must bring her back, a picture of God's relationship with Israel. Pretty good one sentence definition, although some of the terminology is a little bit not exactly what I would like. I mean, I don't have to use it even, but it makes a pretty good point. We'll see in the first chapter of Hosea that it's a little more plain and a little deeper than that one sentence explanation. This is a pretty hard book, a pretty tough book, and it's in the literal example that God gives. It's better really that children aren't in here because it's hard. But God was having to be hard with Israel. They had disobeyed him. They'd turned their back on him. And he'd given them chance after chance after chance, an opportunity, and they refused. And so it became time that he wasn't going to allow it any longer. And yet, in each of these books, as we talked about before, we see at the end of the book, God's promises coming back that there's going to be a good day. And there will be, but that's still in the future. And so the theme of Hosea is return unto the Lord. There's no question that's the point there. Now, I'll throw this in like I do quite a few things, because if you do any study by authors and things, you're going to come across this type of stuff. Some authors say, this wasn't real, what we see in first chapter of Hosea. This is just like a parable in the New Testament. But when God used parables, he never named people specifically. It was more of a generic thing where God gives, these are people's names. This is a real thing. This was harder than Jeremiah's, whom Jeremiah, if you remember, we talked about, he was instructed, you cannot marry. But here we see that Hosea is told, you go and you get a woman. It's interesting, I had never really thought about it, but in reading and researching, I noticed what this one person pointed out. God didn't tell him to go pick Gomer. He said, you go get a person, and he chose Gomer. There's a significance there in many ways, but that's also very clear in God's love for his people. God chose us. He chose Israel, even though he said way, way back there, you're not a mighty people. You're not necessarily a good people. You're not very many, but I chose you. And that's what we see here in Hosea's choice. He chose someone. God didn't tell him he had to pick her specifically, but she did. God chose us. And so all of this is a picture of God's love for a rebellious, wicked people. And he told Hosea, this is the life that you need to live, to show that picture. In verse 1 of chapter 1, it says, the word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of, I'll call it Beeri. I don't know how you pronounce that. There's no little marks and things to tell me. In the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So we're given a very clear time frame. If we know Israel's history, if you study the kings of Israel, then it's very clear what time he lived and served. His ministry lasted approximately 50 years, not as long as Ezekiel's or Daniel's or Jeremiah's, whom each of those were 70 years or so, but close to that. But we're also, as we go along, we'll see this even more, which to me is also interesting. This verse 1, we have more on Hosea than we do any of the other minor prophets. There's very little personal information given about any of the other minor prophets. But we have some information here on Hosea, and yet I don't know who his dad was. I'm not sure. There may be some information there. I'm not sure. I did not take the time to look into that at this point, but it would be interesting to see if there is some more about him, but we don't know much. That's for certain. He gives us 4 kings of Judah, and he gives us the 1 king of Israel. And even though he lists the 4 kings of Judah first, then he lived and spoke and preached to the northern kingdom, or to Israel. His ministry was not to Judah, it was to Israel. And they were already in their time of suffering for the life that they were living. In verse 2, it tells us of chapter 1 that the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea, and the Lord said to Hosea, and I don't think anybody argues that Hosea wrote this book, and yet he doesn't speak in first person all the time. He's not saying I, but he's saying to Hosea. So he's using a different person in this part of the scripture at least. But the Lord said to Hosea, go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms. Now, the one sentence was to marry a prostitute. A wife of whoredoms, it may be the same thing, but it's not exactly the same thing. If you want to do the research on that, feel free to do so. This is a stronger term here in verse 2. And he said, and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredoms, departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. So he went and picked Gomer, and he took her for a wife, knowing her background, knowing her history, but he took her. Now, let me say here, and I'm not trying to be politically correct by any stretch, it doesn't always have to be a woman that lives a wicked or an evil life. Men do the same thing. In fact, you can't have one without the other. Well, in our society, I guess you can, but there's still a very small percentage that do that. And so it's not the point here that women are bad. This woman was bad, but she had a lot of bad men in her life as well. And so it's not that any more than men, but it's the illustration and the point that God is making. And he said, you need to live this life, Hosea, as a picture or a type, an illustration to my people in Israel, the northern kingdom. And it's an exact picture of what God was dealing with. And so first of all, in verse 4, or at the end of verse 3, she bare him a son, and the Lord said unto him, call his name Jezreel. Notice that in each of these, and this goes down through verse 9, before we finish this segment, that God tells him what to name those children specifically. Obviously, there's a purpose for that. I guess I should back up a little bit, and we look at the name of the book, the name of the man that wrote the book, God's prophet. His name is, we call it Hosea, or I do. That's just another way of saying Hoshea or Yeshua. It's about the Savior. That's what his name means if you take it through the Greek, and I did some of that to prepare to make sure I had it all right. That's what it's talking about. This is the Savior. This is the deliverer. And so he marries Gomer. I think the word or the name Gomer is applied to like 6 or 7 people in the scriptures, and that's it. The first time that it's used, it is the daughter of one of the patriarchs, one of the first descendants of Adam in that first or second generation there. And that's the first time that we ever see that word, and it's not used very often in the scriptures. But that word, let me get my notes here. I started to tell, and then I lost my place. But it means to end or to go away. It's not lasting. It's what the word, her name, means. And so then in verse 4, he said, call his name Jezreel. And the word Jezreel means to be scattered, to be spread about. That's what's happened. What happened to Israel was happening then. It happened in the past, but it happened then, and they've been scattered ever since. And so it's prophetic. All of this is telling the story about what needs to be done. But then notice what it says after that. For yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, this is one of those little interesting details, and I didn't take the time to look it up yet. But the word, let's see, Jezreel on the house of Jehu, and he said, and I will cause to cease the kingdom, and come to pass in that day while I will break the bow in Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Okay. Down in verse 6, he says, and he conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, call her name Lo-Ruhamah. That's my pronunciation. For I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. And that means unpitied or not. Notice it says, I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel. They'll be unpitied. There'll be no pity for them. There'll be no, I've just closed my mind to it and it's done. Verse 7, I'll have mercy upon the house of Judah and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow or sword or battle, horses or horsemen. And then in verse 8, it moves on to another season of time. Now when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, call his name Lo-Ammi, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. So him and her had a second son, and that one is named Lo-Ammi, meaning, as it says there, not my people, I'll not be your God. You're just not my people. You're not going to be my people. I'm going to cast you away. Obviously, we know that's what has happened, did happen, has happened, continues to happen, even though they've been called back home. They reestablished their nation in 1948, but they're still not home. They still don't have the things they had before. And so it's a picture of time, and there was a period of years here between verses 4 and verses 9, the birth of these children, and as they were weaned, and she had another one. I can't say you can compare that time to the time that we see, but there is time involved, and that's what is happening. And so this is what the life that Hosea had. I had an interesting conversation just out of the blue with a lady that I deal with in the business world all the time. She's probably in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. They have 3 children, and we were discussing schooling and church and type of things. And she was talking about how she homeschools her kids, and she gave me her reasons, and I won't share those this evening. I mean, I agree with them, but anyway, she said, but I was thinking, she goes, I'm always told that in the Bible that if you have 3 children, that one of them probably won't say faithful to the Lord. And she said, I looked at my husband the other day and I said, if we have one that doesn't, it's going to be that one. So I don't know her children that well, and they're all small, but I thought, wow, that was quite a statement. I don't know where she came up with that in actuality, because I've never heard that preached. I've never heard somebody say that. You can't use this passage for that, because this one was pretty much 3 strikes and you're out. None of these 3 were going to amount to much, obviously. It would be wonderful if we could always say, yes, life is going to be good. We're going to get married. We're going to have our children. Everything's going to be great. Life doesn't go that way, because we're all free moral agents, and we're all human. We're all sinners, saved by grace if we're Christians. But this is somewhat typical. I wish that my family life had been perfect. I've got 2 children. One of them's a Baptist preacher, and the other one claims to be an atheist. You can't make your children be what they don't want to be. They both sit in the same pew, the second pew on that side, most of their life. They were taught the same things. We prayed together the same. We studied the Bible together. They went to church camp together. They went to homeschool for 8.5 years, and they went to Christian school for the rest of those years. One of them it took, and one of them said, no, I don't want that. In fact, if you really want to see some of that, you can get on the internet and you can research the children that have been abused because they were homeschooled or put into Christian school. They were mistreated so badly. There's stuff out there. I know several names on that one website personally that were either related to me or in the Christian schools that we were in over the years. It's just, that's the way things are. Israel was rebellious, and oftentimes we as Christians, or maybe not we, But our families, our friends, our acquaintances, they can be rebellious too and turn completely away. That's what's happened to Israel. And God said, Hosea, this is the life that you need to live. And it was hard. And I used to tell my Christian school kids all the time, yes, life is hard. Then you die. And because they were always complaining about having to do homework or something when we had trips or athletic events. But that's exactly the way that it is. It can be hard in a peaceful, happy way, serving the Lord, or it can just be plain hard. And that's the life that Hosea had. It was hard in his home. It was personally hard, but it was hard in his ministry too, because he faced the same things at home that he faced in his ministry. The people as a whole rejected everything that he had to say. They didn't want to listen. They didn't want to hear what God had to say. They'd heard it all before, and they were tired of it because they didn't like it. It didn't fit. Now, I don't think we ever really mentioned, and because you can't get to all of it anyway, but when we talked about Daniel, and we talked about how that he was given a name that was was the same name actually as the king's son, but, and it was from the Gentile standpoint, because it was a Gentile world in charge. But we know that Daniel became a major person, a very high official in a Gentile kingdom, and yet we know that we read those verses that Daniel's continued to pray daily. He went to the window and he got on his knees and he prayed daily. He was in the world, but he never became part of that world. When Hosea's ministry to Israel 100 years before Daniel, he was in the world. He himself didn't become a part of the world, but his family did and his nation did. And so he suffered right along with them. It was a very, very hard time. Not any worse than Jeremiah or some of the others, that the things that they saw and faced, but it was very hard. And that's what we see with Hosea. And let's go to chapter 6. Oh my goodness, we're almost out of time, and I haven't even got out of chapter 1. In chapter 6, verse 1, this would be probably the key verse to Hosea, if you can call any of them key. Come and let us return unto the Lord. It is a key phrase, no doubt, because this is what it's all about. It's rejection and backsliding, and that term is used several times. In fact, it's used 3 times in the book of Hosea, that they're backsliding. And so this is probably the key verse. Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. Also in the book of Hosea, the word Ephraim is used 36 times. Every time the word Ephraim is used, it's in reference to Israel. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not that smart, not that learned, evidently. I took the map of the Promised Land and the division of the tribes, because I thought, okay, they're considered the northern kingdom, so maybe, Ephraim is the northern. No, Ephraim's not anywhere near north in the northern kingdom. It's just, the land of Ephraim is just barely north of Jerusalem. So I don't know. That's beyond my education. But this is a kind of an interesting oddity. If you look at McGee's notes, he says the term Ephraim is used 36 times in the book of Hosea. Schofield says it's used 37 times. Now, I didn't sit down and count them either. But it always amazes me that people that you look at their notes and study, how that they disagree on points like that. It's not a major point, but how do you miss one or add one? So anyway, that was free. chapter 6, verse 4, it says, O Ephraim, what shall I do unto thee? O Judah, what shall I do unto thee? For your goodness is as morning cloud, and as the early dew it goeth away. So verse 4 of chapter 6, excuse me, kind of puts it very clearly that Ephraim is speaking of Israel, because then he refers to Judah as well. And so that's just but return is used 15 times in the book of Hosea and backsliding 3. So obviously it is a major point of the book of Hosea that we need to return unto the Lord, not to be backslidden, or in speaking of Israel in this passage. Now got time for this one. Chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. Excuse me. It says, For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, without a prince, without a sacrifice, without an image, without an ephod, and without a teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. This application is for the nation Israel. Israel is to be restored, but it was going to be at that point, and still is, a long time. Without a king, he said there in verse 4, many days without a king. Since the Davidic line ended with Zedekiah, it's been over 2,500 years. They rejected Jesus as a king. They've not had a king. They've been under someone else's power or authority for all this period of time. Without a prince, no one is to succeed the throne, and if the Lord is not their Messiah, then they have no one or a prospect for one. Without a sacrifice. The temple was destroyed in AD 70. There has been no sacrifice since then. They don't have their own temple. Now, it was said in the 1970s, I read some of that in the 80s, but it was said that in the 1970s that they prepared the new temple, every bit of it, and that it's in storage. It would be what we would call a prefab, that they have it all cut, shaped, designed, ready to just put it together. I don't know. I've never seen it. But it's been over 40 years since I first heard that. Wouldn't surprise me a bit. We use prefab construction for almost everything anymore. Why wouldn't they do something like that? Because it is going to happen. When it happens, it's going to happen quickly. Now, how long did it take Solomon to build the temple? Was it 20 years, 10 years, 20 years? That time frame's not going to work for the new temple. It's going to have to be, and very easily could be, with the materials and the types of things that we have putting material together today. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to give them any credit, but I mean, goodness, the Jehovah's Witnesses go around the country and put a house together in 3 or 4 days. That's no, and so you take a whole group of people that want to put a temple together. Yeah, it would be something, but yeah. So anyway, that's without an image or without pillars, without an ephod, the sacred garment worn by the high priest, without teraphim, the small images. The people of Israel will not only return to the land, they will seek the Lord their God. This they've not yet done. The latter days, as that verse says, refers to the latter days of Israel after the church has been taken away from by the rapture. Yeah, this is coming, but it's not here yet. And they've waited a long time. God has seen fit for, first of all, to reject them because they first rejected Him. And now we live in the church age, during the age of grace. And how long that will last, we don't know. But that's where we are, and that's where Israel is. A lot of them go home to Israel. More and more of them go back all the time. It's amazing to hear some of those once in a while when they let somebody talk on the TV, on the news, how they'll talk about, yeah, I lived in Timbuktu, and I just felt I need to go to Israel. I need to go back to my people. Yeah, that's what's happening. That's what the Bible said was going to happen. God's drawing them back home for a latter time, whenever that is. And I'm then not even going to get off into too far into the stuff in the news now. 100 and something nations at the UN have voted that this has got to stop with Hamas. What's it been, 2 years since Russia attacked Ukraine? Why hasn't anybody screamed about stopping that? They just want us to keep funding it. Okay, I'm done. I'm moving on. That's why I always watch the news, because I want to know and try to see what stupidity they're trying to tell us, or trying to gauge how stupid they think we really are. I know what they think. But it's crazy. And it's certainly not going to get any better. It's the time we live in. We have to be faithful to the Lord, just like Hosea was. Even if our families fall apart, even if it seems like it's hard for people to stay faithful to the Lord, or people reject us because we are faithful to the Lord, or whatever the case may be, we just have to be faithful, because we know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. We know how the story ends, and that's the wonderful part. That's also always, to me, even as a fairly young Christian, as I begin to read and study the Bible, how that you get to the end of all of these prophets' writings, and it's all about how wonderful it's going to be, because that's the way it's going to be. Israel's going to go back home, and they're going to get pounded, obviously, but it's going to be glorious, because God's people are going to return to Him. And for us as Gentiles, as Christians in the church age, yeah, we're going home to our heavenly home. I mean, this is bad for us, quote unquote. It's nothing like those that are going to spend eternity in the lake of fire. But we're going to our heavenly home one of these days, and it's not that long. Whether He comes back or whether this life is over for us, none of us, it doesn't take that long to get old and go home. I've realized that very clearly lately. And so it's going to happen soon. It's going to be wonderful for us. We need to get to the outline right quick, and then we're just going to have to stop. The first part of the outline of the book of Hosea is personal. The prophet and his faithless wife. That's chapters 1 through 3. He marries Gomer, and she proves faithless, even though she has 3 children. He has 3 children by her. Gomer's faithless, Israel's faithless, God is faithful, Hosea is faithful. Hosea is commanded to take Gomer again. A whole nother beautiful, interesting picture that we just don't have time to go into tonight. But under the law, Gomer should have been stoned. She should have been killed. But that's not what Hosea did. He took her back. We all deserve death. All of the Jews deserve death, because we were unfaithful and we were sinful. But God didn't kill us, did He? He gave us an option. We could be saved. There's a whole lot there. But the second part is the prophetic part. The Lord and the faithless nation Israel, chapters 4 through 14. Israel plays the harlot, chapters 4 and 5. She's guilty. Israel turns from God in chapter 5. Ephraim will return in the last days. We touched on that, chapter 6. And then chapter 7 through 12, Israel could escape judgment by turning to God, who loves her, but obviously refused. And then And chapters 13 and 14, Israel or Ephraim will turn from idols to God in the last days. Israel will be judged in the present in chapter 13. Israel will be saved and glorified in the future, chapter 14. Hosea is an awesome little book. Time frame about 50 years. Hosea was faithful. He didn't quit. He didn't quit on his family. I have a good Christian friend that his personal life's almost exactly like this illustration. I guess that's part of why it was so hard for me to, when I really got to studying this book, I don't see how people do it. But took her back, children, and continues to serve the Lord. We can be faithful. And the Bible tells us, thankfully, that He'll not put more on us than we can stand. And I'm thankful for that every day, because there's a lot out there. I'm thankful that we have a faithful, loving God. Brother Matt, I better turn it over to you.